Months of grueling practice were behind me, a series of dogfights, mostly hit-and-run affairs on our part, but several battles worthy of the name. No longer was I the green and timorous pilot of that first encounter. I now had 2 enemy planes to my credit, and at Oita I had been promoted to corporal, a rank not easily attained then by Japanese enlisted men. Now, grim though the task might be, I was an escort, leading and protecting our kamikaze, defending them against the enemy to that final, fateful dive, then returning to give my report. That was my job. Who else, I asked myself, had a more important one? And at night, there would be Toyoko. Toyoko had said she loved me, and that was enough. She had promised me that the war would end before it was too late, and I took refuge in those words. Never mind that they were tendered in the crucible of emotion, in a moment of desperation. Still I clung to them, strongly immured in the household of denial. That was the only way by now that I could survive psychologically. Yes, something would happen to save me. Not only would the war end in time, but something highly extraordinary would occur. Occasionally, in fact, the feeling pulsed strangely at unexpected moments, even within the onset of my dreams. It was a kind of prescience that generated a strange effervescence throughout my veins, my entire epithelium. Even now, though, my moods fluctuated. Doom still hovered and often overflowed the boundaries of my little sanctuary. Today, in fact, it was encroaching strongly. Today, Nakamura and I were flying together. I had spotted him in the chow hall, ahead of me in line, and followed him to a table. "Yai, Tomodachi," I said, and roughed his head playfully. Simply an informal greeting, an effort to release tension. "Seen Tatsuno this morning?" Nakamura glanced up at me, but the familiar grin was gone. "Yes, I've seen Tatsuno," he said. "Well, what's the matter? Where is he?" "Getting ready," he answered. I felt the sudden chill, but hoped for the best. "Going with us? Escort now?" "Going with us, yes. Escort, no." Something filled my chest like cold sludge. "He's lucky," Nakamura said. "No more worries, not after noon today. You and I, we're still waiting, still on the tines of a pitchfork." I placed my chopsticks on the table very carefully, as if that simple act were of utmost importance. "When did he find out? Why didn't someone tell me earlier so I could have at least been with him?" "It only happened yesterday," Nakamura said coldly. "And you haven't exactly been the most available man in the world this past month. You should try reading the orders sometime, Kuwahara. You don't want to miss your own." "Really?" I retorted, angry over my very guilt. "So what are they going to do? Shoot me?" Then, riddled with contrition, I bowed my head, eyelids clenched, and locked my hands together. "You're right. I haven't been a friend to him at all lately. Not to you or anybody else." Fiercely, I bit my knuckle. That was the only thing I could tolerate for the moment, my teeth cutting into the skin and bone. "I did try to tell you, incidentally," Nakamura said. "Went to your girl's apartment about 10, but you weren't there." "We were down at the beach. Nice! Lots nicer than being with—" "Stop it!" I banged my fists on the table and grated my chair back, igniting glances of surprise from those nearby. Then I stood, leaving my food untouched, and blundered my way out of the chow hall. Everyone, it seemed, was staring at me. Where was Tatsuno? I had to find him, tell him we'd go down together. To hell with waiting for orders. I'd cover him all the way, end this madness together. My dearest friend would not go alone. Without realizing it, I was running, hearing Nakamura's voice yet not hearing it. 300 yards to Tatsuno's barracks, and I was running at top speed, feeling the blood pound in my temples, hearing my breath rasp in my lungs, vaguely aware that the intense physical conditioning of basic training had diminished somewhat. Then, abruptly, I stopped. Tatsuno and his company of the damned would not be in their barracks now. They would be undergoing their final briefing. Bleakly I turned and shambled off toward my own barracks. 2 hours before takeoff time, an hour before my own briefing. Nothing to do but wait. I wouldn't even check my Hayabusa now, not until time to go. It would either fly or it wouldn't. All was in the hands of fate. Nakamura was waiting when I entered the barracks, lying back on one of the bunks, hands locked behind his head, staring at the ceiling. He sat up at my approach, and I settled down beside him, hearing the springs squeak. "Don't feel bad, Yasbei," he mumbled. "I apologize for what I said because Tatsuno wouldn't have wanted it otherwise. Not for you. You found somebody worth spending time with, all the time you've got left. I was just envious." "But I haven't even seen him for a week," I said. "Do you know how long he and I have known each other?" He nodded. "Ever since you were about 4 years old," Tats told me. "But what good could you have done him hanging around here? None of us know when it's coming. We'd probably just be getting on each other's nerves." He shrugged. "I haven't seen him that much myself. He's been up to the mountain, visiting that priest you told us about." For a long time we remained there. Silence, except for a faint and constant ringing in my ears like the sound of a distant locust. "I have a strange feeling about today," Nakamura mused. His words were scarcely audible. "Today maybe we'll all go down, one way or another. Pay our debt to the Emperor." Somehow the remaining time passed, more as though it had suddenly evaporated. A blank space, a void without dimension or recollection. Then Nakamura and I were there on the airfield, suited up, ready to fly. 16 pilots all told, 4 of us escorts, the remaining dozen never to return. They had grouped now for final directions before an officer holding a large map of the Pacific. Minutes later it was time for the last formation, and we all stood at attention, hearing the parting words of our commanding officer. From the corner of my eye I could see Tatsuno, but he didn't look quite real, more like a pallid facsimile of the person he had once been. His spirit had perhaps already gone like the wind among the lanterns. Around the shaved skull of each kamikaze was bound a small flag, the crimson rising sun directly over his forehead. These departures were never conducted in a perfunctory manner. Instead, there was much ceremony, toasts, valiant speeches, most of which I had already almost learned by rote. Boys and girls, drafted from school to work on the base, were permitted to assemble with the squadron on these occasions. Among the fringe of onlookers, several girls began to cry, then grew quiet as our commanding officer, Yoshiro Tsubaki, prepared to address us. His voice commenced in a kind of nasal whine, droning on and on, mingling with the heat waves, occasionally descending to sombre guttural tones. Then, at last, reached its conclusion. "And so, valiant comrades, smile as you go. There is a place prepared for you in the glorious and esteemed presence of your ancestors, where you will attain unto everlasting honour. Samurai of the skies, guardian warriors, we bid you sayonara." Now, at last, it was time to sing the parting battle song. "The airman's colour is the colour of the cherry blossom. See, oh see, how the blossoms fall on the hills of Yoshino. If we are born proud sons of the Yamato race, let us die. Let us die with triumph, fighting in the sky." So now, at last, the final toast, the sake glasses raised and the resurgent cry, "Tenoheika Banazai, long live the Emperor!" Our kamikaze are saying sayonara now, laughing and joking nervously like student athletes before a race. Climbing into their obsolete aircraft, antiquated fighters, even trainers. The old planes don't matter greatly. After all, it is their final trip as well. The smiles? Perhaps they will remain on some of those faces to the very last. For others, the smiles will die as they settle into their cockpits. Perhaps for some, very few, the serpents of fear won't strike until the enemy ships appeared. And what is courage? A question I have never fully resolved. Who, in fact, is the most courageous? The man who feels the least fear, or the man who feels the most and still fulfills his obligation. But now there is only one man, a very young one, little more than a boy. Yes, now with Nakamura, the two of them walking toward me. He does not look real, his face pallid, almost transparent. Yes, the spirit has gone ahead. His body will mechanically but faithfully fulfill its duty. What a strange and haunting smile carved upon that waxen visage, the secret perhaps to some immense enigma that the rest of us have yet to fathom. Tell him you'll cover him all the way, that you will die together. But no, that is not what he seeks, and something strangles any words. Your time will come soon enough, Yasuo Kuwahara, the time that fate has ordained. That is right. By repeating those words, I retreat from the groundswell, the sorrow and the guilt. I am no friend, though. I haven't been for weeks. No friend. And never once has he presumed to tell me the truth. The lead in my chest is solid now, crushing. The words emerge painfully under much pressure. Tatsuno, We reach out, and our hands clasp fiercely, but despite the heat of the sun, his fingers are cold. Of course, the spirit is elsewhere. Nakamura, a better friend than I, accords us this final moment. Remember, Yasbei? The words came, almost subliminally it seemed. How we always dreamed of flying together? Yes, I said. Our gazes had blended inseparably for the moment. The ultimate searching of souls. Well, he murmured, and the smile increased. It has come to pass. We fly together today. Yes. Muscles on one side of my face were twitching. I will follow you soon, all the way, perhaps this very afternoon. Then, unexpectedly, he extended the other hand. It was wrapped in a meagre bandage, and the bandage was turning red. Here, Yasuo. Take care of this for me. It is not much to send, but you know what to do. Swiftly, I looked away. Tatsuno had just given me the little finger of his left hand. Our kamikaze almost always left a part of themselves behind, a lock of hair, fingernails, an entire finger for cremation. The ashes were then sent home to repose in the family shrine. There, in a special alcove with the pictures of their ancestors. Once yearly, a priest would enter that room to pray. The first motors were beginning to cough and rev, and suddenly I flung my arms around Tatsuno crushingly, as though somehow I might preserve him. Preserve at least all that had gone before, all that we had meant to each other. For that instant, we clung together on the edge of a great chasm. Then we broke apart, and somehow, following another blank space, I was seated in my Hayabusa, fastening the safety belt, feeling the controls, adjusting the goggles on my forehead. The entire base was grumbling now on the brink of departure. I checked the prop mixture, pressed the starter button, and one cylinder caught in a high coughing explosion, then another and another. The motor surged ravenously, then adjusted in a steady, powerful roar. One by one, we were moving out. Lethargic, winged beasts awakened from their lairs. Uno, a veteran of 5 kills, was in the lead, and I was close behind. Signals coming laconically from the control tower. Already the onlookers were in another world, withdrawn. A ring of sad faces and waving hands, fading as the prop blasts hurled sand, bits of straw and paper. The commanding officer, the remaining pilots, the students, the mechanics come to bid farewell to the ships they had nurtured for a season, all shrinking now as the airfield fell away beneath us. Chapter 24. The Divine Storm. It was good flying weather. The seasonal rains had at last subsided, leaving the skies a splendid morning glory blue. Within moments we were over the mountains, and more than ever it seemed to me that Japan itself was essentially an endless conglomeration of mountains, great rolling remnants from the past, when islands reared volcanically like stricken monsters, when fires burst from nature's hidden furnaces to be quenched at last by time and the sea. We left the ancient shores, the shores of our 4 islands, the clangorous cities and quiet rural villages that were home to more than 70 million people. 30 minutes after takeoff, we landed to refuel at Kagoshima on the island of Kyushu. For 12 men, most of them still mere boys chronologically, the final glimpse of their homeland. For 12 men, the 3-hour flight onward to Okinawa would be all that remained, their last short hours upon the earth. Oka and Yamamoto had departed 3 weeks ago, gone forever, blazing their way into history and the infinite regions of oblivion. Mere dream figures now, their eyes, their forms, their voices fading, etherizing, echoing ever more faintly into the past. Minutes from Kagoshima, we spotted a flight of B-29s escorted by Grummons travelling towards Shikoku. Altering our course slightly, we faded into a skein of wispy cirrus clouds, then continued steadily onward into the day. Far below rolled the Pacific, an immense ever-wrinkling green, brilliant and dazzling under the sun, in places like 1 billion holiday sparklers. My mind was teeming with memory now. Home, like my vanished friends, was a poignant fantasy that pulsed and subsided, and always, irresistibly, the face of Toyoko. As the minutes fled, I saw her countless times in countless ways. Occasionally merely the face of a phantom tinged with subtle tones of silver and ivy in the shadows, ethereal in the garden moonlight, or softly luminescent beneath the red-orange glow of a lantern gateway. Sometimes her clear dark eyes flowing with inquiry or sweet appraisal, the inevitable tint of loving mischief, of motherly empathy and amusement. At times our glances had locked so closely and unwaveringly that I could descry tiny replicas of my own face within her pupils. How often I had found myself entranced by the phenomenal dance-like fluidity of Toyoko's movements as her fingers traced the strings of a samisen, or lilting back her long and fragrant hair from the nape of her neck. How I cherished the way she walked in her tight kimono, such precise and exquisitely dainty steps, one foot placed directly before the other. Yet always there was the great expanding void within me, and increasingly at last to the point of obsession, the words of Nakamura, his fateful augury only a short time earlier in another world. Today maybe we will all go down, pay our debt to the Emperor. Once, despite all, I shook my head, half smiling. Kenji Nakamura, what an irrepressible spirit. Nakamura, the recruit who had first befriended me during those soul-ravaging days of basic when it seemed as though our entrails were being wrenched from our throats with grappling hooks. Nakamura, my loquacious comrade, faithful and highly practical in many ways, but who also lived with remarkable abandon. Even more increasingly I thought about Tatsuno. I remembered a day long ago when we had run laughing through the streets of Onomichi, swatting at each other with our school caps. How young, how childlike and innocent back then, 2 years into the past. Tatsuno, forever my best friend, sometimes playful, a prankster, yet loyal unto death, often introspective, harbouring deep and stirring thoughts. Tatsuno, Tatsuno. I repeated his name many times, shaking my head and fleetingly closing my eyes, droning onward, ever more entranced by an unyielding sense of immensity. Clouds were forming intermittently now just beneath us, whiter than the purest snow, casting shadows of dun and olive on the waters 20,000 feet below. Suddenly my radio receiver issued a sharp reaming, startling me from my reverie. A blare of static that pained my eardrums. 1 hour remaining, the words crackled. Ahead and slightly below, at a 50-foot diagonal to my right wing tip, was our flight leader, Sergeant Motoharu Uno. His head slowly pivoted, constantly surveying our surroundings, and upon catching his glance I held up my gloved fist, responding with a single nod. Age 26, Uno was one of the old men in our squadron. Squat and sinewy, he had known little except rice farming until the war, but he was highly intelligent with remarkable strength and coordination. Awesome courage. He also possessed uncanny vision and was known by his friends as Washi, Eagle. Soon, if Uno survived what lay beyond, perhaps because of it, he would become an ace. Ahead, the clouds were enlarging, darkening slightly like dirty cotton along their undersides, extinguishing the sun-dazzled expanses below. Our kamikaze were travelling in sections of 3, each a lethal arrow slicing undeviatingly onward toward the enemy. On and on and on, the harsh, strangely comforting vibrato of my motor rising and falling against the gathering afternoon. Miraculously, time itself had faded like vapour on an immense mirror. As we neared our destination, the dry plaster feeling in my mouth increased, a feeling that inevitably occurred at such moments. And, as always, my head began to throb, an aching throughout my upper eye sockets and brow, gradually asserting itself within the base of my skull as well. My gloved hands clenched the controls, and I opened them, flexing my fingers. Beneath my leather aviator cap, a drop of sweat trickled slyly down my temple. Then another. "Too tense, Kuwahara," I warned. "Too taut." Ironically, the words came with great intensity. Again the finger flexing, followed by the massaging of the back of my neck and scalp with one hand, the rotating of my head. "Loosen up, Kuwahara. Loosen up." Shoulders rising, rotating along with my head, falling. Swift, painful glimpses of my past, my home and family. Of Toyoko. Toyoko embraced in slumber, Toyoko in her white nightgown with the lacy fringes. Her brow and cheekbones graced with light, lips touched with their faint entrancing dream smile, impossibly far away and long ago now, in some lost dimension. Strange how so many thoughts, all irrelevant to the question at hand, continued to beset me. Perhaps they were a part of my defence mechanism, sedatives against the rat-like gnawings of fear. Soon, though, very soon, those sedatives would wear off completely. Long ago, it seemed, or was it only moments, we had passed the tiny islands of Yaku and Togara, and now, with Amami dissolving in our wake, we saw the first dim outlines of our fate. Okinawa, an electric shock in my right neck cord, a fierce burning that nearly welled beyond containment. Yes, Okinawa, sprawling there on the ocean's bosom like an immense and slowly writhing sea monster. Then came another jolt as Uno waggled his wings. Far off I saw their faint silvery wakes, and now, the first American ships, Ichi, Ni, San, Shi. I kept counting. 25 in all, and there, no larger than cucumber seeds at first, directly in the centre of the task force, was our quarry. 4 aircraft carriers, closely attended by battleships and a wider perimeter of cruisers and destroyers. Again Uno waggled his wings, and we began our descent. At 10,000 feet we levelled off, and our 12 kamikaze forged ahead of us at full power. Now time was suddenly in ruthless acceleration, the ships growing at a rate that was literally stupefying. Now they were opening fire, a great spasmodic concatenation of reflex actions from their giant guns, each followed by explosive puffs of black smoke and spouts of dull orange from the ships engulfed in cloud shadow. So at last the waiting was over. I even welcomed the fear, for with it came the wild rush of adrenaline and sense of inevitability. Whatever our skills might be, however valiantly and cunningly we might perform, we had now entered the portals of fate, and there was no turning back. Simultaneously, the strange yet familiar voice inside continued to assure me that death happened only to other people. Soon, somehow, it would all be past. I would return unharmed and make my report as always. Ahead, the first suicide formation is diving now at 45 degrees, followed methodically by the next, and the next. Tatsuno is leading the final section in an ancient Navy aircraft, ready to fall apart long before its last takeoff, a Mitsubishi Type 96. Now the fated 12 are opening their cockpits and their silken scarves are fluttering in the wind, a symbol of their willingness to die for the Emperor, their final acknowledgement of that grand and ultimate honour. Always the wind, the divine wind. The American fleet is less than a mile ahead, and I am sweating profusely, watching, my mind roaring, and the sound within is somehow far greater than that of my Hayabusa. The lead Kamikaze plummets, screaming almost vertically into the flak. He'll never reach the carriers, that seems certain. Instead, he levels and veers sharply to the right, making for a cruiser near the convoy's perimeter. And for a moment it looks as if he'll succeed. But no, he's hit, virtually wrenched apart, all in the fraction of a second. Only a yellow flare remains, rapidly disintegrating, fading to ashes, to nothing. Everything is a blur now, a mixture of motion, sound, and colour, the variegated green of the ocean, the stark hard grey of the ships, the unremitting belches of black as their 5-inch rifles fire deadly bursts of shrapnel, periodic flashes of orange from the shadows, and a virtual maze of white-hot red from the tracer bullets leaving their 20 and 40mm anti-aircraft guns, tracers that seem to arch almost languorously. 2 more planes explode simultaneously, but a 4th wails unscathed through the entire barrage, levelling beneath the flak umbrella only 20 feet above the surface. A hit. He has struck a destroyer directly above its waterline. It shudders as if assaulted by an immense battering ram, and I actually seem to hear the bellowing explosion, then another and another, above the endless roar of my motor. It's good. It's good. The vessel is already in its death throes, water gushing in through a monstrous hole that has nearly torn it apart, surging and plunging over the bow. As I follow my flight leader, climbing and arching along the battle's perimeter, the destroyer upends, stern, black and ominous, in a curious state of suspension, as though attesting to its own demise. Then, almost instantaneously, it is gone. Swallowed. Non-existent. Already I have lost track of the flights. They have been scattered like dragonflies before a gale. The 2 trailing formations are knifing downward through the lethal blossoms of flak. Everywhere, incredible violence and confusion. One of our planes is roaring low across the water, machine guns kicking up countless spouts all around him, headed straight for a carrier, closing the gap at tremendous speed with less than 200 yards remaining. Straight in? He'll score a direct hit. My entire body surges with an awful jubilation. But no, they stop him, blowing off a wing and most of his tail section. Veering lamely, he collides with the ship's bow, inflicting little damage. The enemy defence is almost impregnable. Only a gnat can penetrate that fire screen. 2 more suicides lance at the second carrier, and one disintegrates fairly, splattering the water with its remains. The other bursts into flame like a monstrous blowtorch, makes a half-roll, and arches into the ocean upside down. So far, I am certain, we have sunk only 1 ship, and already, within mere minutes, we have few aircraft left. Hard to know where they are now, even discern them because of the swelling murkiness of the horizon, but at least 2 planes have temporarily secluded themselves there. And now, unexpectedly, they materialize a mile to our left. We circle high above, watching. 2 planes, an advanced trainer and a Mitsubishi fighter are completing a wide turn, heading swiftly back toward us. I squint, and the realization seizes my innards. That Mitsubishi, it's Tatsuno. Yes, definitely. Tatsuno was in the last section, our only Navy plane. The 2 of them climb at full throttle, then begin their dive, charging toward the convoy's heart. The trainer, however, is rapidly falling behind, and seconds later he is ripped from the sky by enemy fighters. His wings are savagely torn away, the entire plane almost rent in half, and he corkscrews insanely downward, leaving a silver-gold waterspout in a brilliant patch of sunlight. Tatsuno is alone now, still unscathed, making a perfect run, better than anything they ever taught us in school. Tatsuno, Tatsuno. Fire spouts along his tail section. but he remains on course. A tanker wallows just ahead like a vast sullen whale. The orange tatters along Tatsuno's fuselage extend with devilish exultation, and his plane is an all-devouring flame. "Tatsuno! He's closing! A hit! A hit!" An enormous explosion bellows upward, rocking the sky, vomiting thick black smoke that momentarily seems to swallow the very flames generating it. Then comes a staccato series of smaller bursts, stupendous eruptions of brilliant orange, and one last mighty blast that seems to shake the sea like canvas in a wind. The tanker is going down along with my dearest friend. No trace now but the widening shroud of oil. Our kamikaze were gone now, all 12 to another world. We had sunk one destroyer and one tanker, wounded a cruiser, also severely damaged a battleship, something I didn't learn until later. But there was no time then to ponder our success or to mourn our loss. The fighter 50 yards ahead and to my left waggled its wings in warning. My friend Nakamura, and he was jabbing with his finger toward a flight of Grumman hellcats swarming in above us at 4 o'clock. I had spotted them fleetingly earlier, streaking from the carriers, hornets angered at having their nests invaded, then lost sight of them in the melee. Now, fantastically, 3 hellcats were on my tail with startling speed and determination, firing savage bursts from only 300 yards. 2 more behind them, slightly lower and about half a mile to the right, were veering my way, manoeuvring into firing position. Lead chewed my stabilizer, sheared off the tip of my rudder, and a 50 caliber slug pierced the canopy only 6 inches above my head. Simultaneously I spotted Uno, emerging from a skein of clouds just beyond. He was easing into a tight right curve, and I followed, rotating in a half roll and banking into a radical turn. Now, within seconds, I had reversed positions with my enemy and I was on his tail, trying desperately to centre him in my gun sights. Momentarily we seemed to be on opposite ends of a teetering balance scale. Then it adjusted, and I was tracking him, blasting away with my nose cannon. Missing! Angrily I opened up with my machine guns, but in my eagerness failed to aim with precision. Only 2 hellcats discernible now, and they flared frantically in opposite directions, my quarry swerving to the right. The other bore strongly to the left, only to draw fire from a Hayabusa coming at him head-on. "Nakamura!" The 2 planes screamed past each other, almost colliding, the hellcat taking lead, and I glanced fleetingly over my shoulder to see it casting slender streamers of flame as it distanced against the sun. Meanwhile, my own foe was climbing rapidly, and I roared after him, firing a series of short, rapid bursts. Realizing his predicament, the hellcat angled off to the left, dropping away, spiralling nose over wingtip into a shallow dive. I had anticipated him, however, and followed doggedly, opening up again with my guns. This time smoke began to billow from beneath his engine cowling, so thickly I barely saw the cockpit open as the pilot struggled free and rolled off the wing next to the fuselage. He then plummeted downward like a rock for some distance before pulling his chute, and the canopy popped, blossoming white, drifting against the deep blue of the water. Only seconds later, an enemy plane was attacking me broadside from about 200 yards. I could see the lethal sparkling of his 50 calibers against a large soot-coloured cloud. Then, incredibly, the hellcat disintegrated in a blinding starburst the colour of the sun. One of our Hayabusa was cutting a high, wailing arch along the cloud's upper border, etched triumphantly against the dazzling sky beyond. The contrasting light was so intense it hurt my eyes, and I squinted painfully just as the Hayabusa vanished into the mounting darkness ahead. Not, however, before I had glimpsed the pilot's profile through the glint of sunlight on his goggles, the fierce, determined tightness of his lips. Uno. I shook my head in admiration and amazement. He had blasted it directly in the fuel tank with his 25mm cannons. His wartime total now tallied 6 confirmed kills, and at least 3 or 4 probables. My own score now stood at 3, as did Nakamura's. "Run for it!" His words crackled in my headphones. "Too many? Head for home." Abruptly now, the enemy was materializing from almost all directions, everywhere. Blue wings, white stars, and blunt, belligerent snouts, all avidly bent on revenge. My friends were nowhere in sight, and I slammed the throttle to the firewall, roaring north toward home and the secrecy of the clouds. Several Hellcats were still streaking after me, diving head-on. Instinctively, I hit the stick, pivoting left, and all of them overshot me, but one flying higher in the rear. Torquing radically the opposite direction, I descended in a gargantuan, groaning barrel roll, feeling my entire airframe shuddering as the G-force slammed, squeezing the blood from my head and eyes. My enemy followed with fiendish tenacity only 100 yards or so behind, somehow actually closing the distance. Sledgehammer sounds, and I flinched, feeling my heart lurch. I'd been hit. But for the moment, no discernible damage, and it was time for even more desperate measures. Again I rolled, angling now into a steep vertical dive. Down, down, down. The air shrieking past my cockpit, gradually spiralling downward, seeming to rotate with the very earth, then rolling more widely. Ships growing amid the broadening sprawls of smoke, revolving as if the ocean itself had become a vast cosmic whirlpool. Long hours of suicide practice had honed my skill in such manoeuvres, but soon I was in reach of the surface fire again. A battleship along the convoy's periphery was opening up with his heavy rifles, and the flak was collecting close about me. I pulled from my dive in a monstrous, shuddering, gut-wrenching groan, barely above the water, feeling as if the flesh would rip from my bones, losing my vision and sense of direction, blacking out, as though my head had been dragged into my shoulders. The tenacious Grumman Hellcat, however, was less fortunate, accidentally blasted apart by his own ships at the very nadir of his descent. Glancing wildly at my wavering compass needle and trembling Grio horizon, I somehow reoriented myself and hurtled on north, scrambling for altitude. The American ships were still salvoing at Longrange, while one remaining fighter plane continued to fire at me from several hundred yards away. For an instant, I felt a smug sense of triumph. Simultaneously, I heard a series of feral pinging noises followed by a clank. My heart squirmed, pounding, and my throat constricted as I waited for the flames, the smoke, the explosion. For several agonizing seconds the motor faltered, then blessedly caught hold as the Hellcat swiftly drew closer. Ahead, a short distance to the northwest, the clouds were mounting to awesome heights in grey-black anvils, cumulonimbus, and I headed for them full throttle, blending my will with that of my plane, uniting all our remaining strength in a final bid for emancipation. Faster, Kuwahara, faster. Holes appearing supernaturally in my right wing, more pinging. Then I was engulfed in darkness. I grinned triumphantly into the gloom, convinced now that I had made it. The enemy had battled ferociously, everything in his power, everything upon the face of the ocean, everything that he could hurl into the sky. The enemy had failed. Our own forces, on the other hand, had inflicted substantial damage. Not far ahead, lightning crackled lividly, fracturing the walls of darkness, which reunited almost instantly with an ominous concussion more powerful than all the guns below combined. Close, very close. But at least, I told myself, the elements were impersonal. Now, though, my cockpit had filled with the odour of burning rubber and superheated metal, and the anxiety soon returned. No way of knowing how much damage I had sustained earlier, and I was also faced with another problem. Rain was slashing my wings and cockpit, mounting gusts that often left me blindfolded, except for the incessant flashes of lightning, each accompanied by a stunning jar as if truckloads of lumber were being dumped against me from every side. I had encountered storms before, but never one like this. Clouds converged about me like a herd of angry elephants, transforming to monstrous proportions and colours from grey to India ink, roiling, incessantly roiling, in an ominous maelstrom. The winds and rain lashed savagely, slicing through the jagged holes in my greenhouse. Again my motor coughed, windmilling, and I held my breath, practically igniting with tension. Yet once again it caught, and the burning smell was abating, probably because of the deluge. Temples throbbing, I squinted painfully, praying for the return of day. Off somewhere lay the afternoon, yet there, near the storm's gullet, it was fast approaching midnight. Each flash of lightning spawned crashes of thunder reverberating off in stupendous chain reactions, numbing the very atmosphere. My sense of direction was gone, decimated, and with each concussion my compass needle gyrated erratically. My turn and bank indicator was useless, stunned. No matter what awaited me out there in the daylight, I had to escape fast. But where? Far off to my left was a pallid smear of yellow-grey, and instinctively I headed toward it like a moth to lamplight. The glow was increasing when suddenly the belly of my plane seemed to collapse. It was like a blow to the sternum, and I clutched in desperation at the controls as my Hayabusa dropped 100 feet within the next second, prop clawing helplessly. The motor rattled as if it would tear loose, and the entire frame vibrated frantically. Then the pressure subsided, and I was blasted upward, shaken and tumbled hopelessly. Dazed, head spinning, I battled for equilibrium, some semblance of control, yet there was none. Slam my rudder to the left, and I could as easily be hurled to the right. Wrench my elevator upward, and I might be rammed toward the sea. Instruments battered and dying, my motor steadily becoming more asthmatic. I was desperately tired, both body and soul. Minutes before I had welcomed the storm, all but laughed in its face. Now I was growing numb, arms nearly paralyzed. Even the inside of my plane was revolving dizzily, my vision so blurred I could no longer even tell whether it was raining or not. Again, time had ceased to exist. Once, strangely, the winds abated, and I found myself drifting in a kind of vacuum, blinking at the blue flashes and hearing the reverberations with strange curiosity. Like an automaton, I was flying with only one purpose, to continue. On and on until the great light was born again. Then the winds came raving back. The flashes illumined a vast cloud with magnificent tones of peach and rose, its countenance forming a diabolical leer as greater darkness ensued. No longer were the elements impersonal. The lightning was not crackling, it was laughing maliciously, and the thunder bellowed, hammering with its fists. The wind, above all, hated me, cursing, buffeting, wrenching, and now I knew that I had been betrayed with the promise of sanctuary to my destruction. Even nature was with the enemy. An abrupt volcanic eruption of air and cloud confirmed the fact, catching my right-wing tip and hurling me in a series of huge erratic gyrations as agonized groanings burst from the bowels of my aircraft. Down, down, an endless cone of blackness to my doom. Death, death. All very swiftly now. Oblivion. Yet even then, far off down that final passage, something willed the battered, shuddering entity that had been my fighter back to life, exerted effort against alien controls. Astoundingly, I was flying level, waves the colour of molasses curling at my belly, scudding with froth, and I was once more in command. As from some remote distance, sounds of the motor rose and fell, and my aircraft actually seemed to be skimming the very wave crests. Momentarily I had recollections of my first glider competition, being towed for that first breath-stifling takeoff across the turf at Onomichi High School. So low now, so very low, the mere slight tilting of one wing, only a few degrees, and the ocean would have me forever. And why fight it? The great waters had taken my friends, taken Tatsuno, always taken whatever they wanted. Only a few slight ridiculous degrees. But my fear had evaporated, giving way to perversity. Yes, now I would taunt the ocean, making it wait, tantalizing the endless hypnotic waves, dipping my wing-tips boldly, but never quite close enough. Not until the appropriate moment. No doubt they would have me in time, but on my own terms, Not until I had laughed and humiliated them, as the lightning and thunder had laughed and roared, humiliating me. Suddenly the water flashed green. An instant later it transformed to the colour of white-hot slag, temporarily blinding me. First by the darkness, and now by the light. I squinted painfully, blinking, seeing only strange amoeboid forms that welled in blend of dark maroon and irregular, ever-melting fringes of saffron. And gradually the pain eased. Gradually sight was restored. I was in a world of dazzling green and gold. The heavens above and beyond were completely cloudless, supernally blue. Cautiously, very gradually, I ascended to 1,000 feet as my body and mind, my very spirit, relaxed. No ships, no planes, only the endless water and the endless sky as I droned steadily onward alone, the only living soul in the world, lost amid the lonely reaches of sun and sea. The motor sputtered, and I glanced at my fuel gauge. A mere 25 gallons, little time left. Apprehensively, fearing the American ears listening somewhere beyond the horizon, I began to signal. No answer. I waited, holding my breath, tried again. Still no reply. My fighter was winging onward, staunch and true once more. Wonderful creature. How I loved and admired it. But now, after everything, to run out of fuel, to expire helplessly like a strong man whose wrists were slashed. What a grand and ridiculous irony. Hopeless. But I had an obligation to do my best. Like my samurai ancestors, I might ultimately die, yet never be vanquished. I adjusted the fuel control to its thinnest mixture, cut the propeller cycles down to the minimum, below 1,500 RPMs. Any less, and my plane would stall. Again I signalled, caught my breath and waited. Static. Then a voice. Faint and dry initially, the buzzing of a wasp trapped in a jar, a voice from the regions of the dead. But a voice, an answer, China. "This is Nanking." I had made connections. A few degrees to my left and straight ahead was the island of Formosa, and at last I could discern its outlines, like a mere translucent watermark at first, the faintest lineation on a broad pastel of grey and green. Soon, though, it became more substantial, seeming to rise and fall on its gathering tides like an immense ship, a carrier of colossal dimension unlike all others, one that offered hope. Sanctuary. My Hayabusa purred steadily onward, constant and true, and once I looked back. Something warned me not to, a profound sense of superstition, that even the subtlest glance might welcome the tentacles of fate. Nevertheless, I looked. Somewhere off in that golden afternoon lay Okinawa and the enemy task force. Only 23 ships instead of 25. Somewhere drifted the remains of our 12 Kamikaze, the remains of my friend Tatsuno. And there, hanging slumberous now, far behind, lurked the storm. The divine storm had saved me as it had saved my people centuries before. Chapter 25. The Lonely Place. A short while later, I covered the remaining distance to Formosa and landed at Taihoku, the main base. Then, with scarcely a moment's rest and only a perfunctory inspection of my wounded aircraft, I flew as directed to a smaller base close by near Kieran. There I remained for nearly 2 weeks because of insufficient fuel. Yes, conditions were now that desperate. The bases in Formosa consuming their final rations. Barely enough fuel for the suicides who left each day. Despite my exhaustion, however, my first concern upon landing was my aircraft. During the months, and now especially, I had developed an affection for that ship. My Hayabusa had become a living creature, a loyal and faithful friend I not only understood but also loved. Somehow along the way it had acquired a soul. It had helped me vanquish my enemies, and even when all appeared hopeless, it had persevered, prevailed against the storm. Parts of the tail assembly and the tip of my right wing had been sheared off, and several bullet holes in the fuselage had left gaps 2 to 3 inches in diameter where they exited. The motor itself had stopped lead, but amazingly, merely faltered for a time. In addition, there were 2 holes through my canopy. One bullet had gashed the dome, and another had pierced the glass only an inch or 2 above my head. How close, how very close. What a slender, wavering path we tread between life and death. My plane, in any event, was still functional, seemingly almost invulnerable, and upon landing at the assigned base, I rested beside it for a time in the shade of some palm trees on the airstrip's edge. Never, even during my most arduous days in basic training, had I been so exhausted. I would make my report in due time when I felt ready, but at the moment I seemed to be dissolving. 2 mechanics were approaching in the distance, and across the concrete runway preparations were underway for the next day's mission. Obviously the area had been bombed a short time earlier, and crews were still filling in the remaining craters, packing the dirt down with antiquated steamrollers. Drained now, almost to the point of stupor, I lay back at the jungle's edge, my head resting upon my folded flight jacket, waiting for the mechanics. The air was hot and humid, and I was already covered with sweat. What would it be like, I wondered vaguely, to be a mechanic, simply to repair planes instead of flying them? Not so long ago, the very thought had filled me with scorn. Lately, though, I had begun to view the matter quite differently. What a simple, pleasant life, freed from the eternal stress and anxiety, the constant gnawing of fear. The chance to live. For a moment I actually resented the 2 men approaching me. What a luxury, the right to live. I closed my eyes and saw the face of Toyoko, the smile and her own eyes filled with that incredible tenderness and compassion. I heard her words. The war will end. The war will end in time. Merely a forlorn hope, or was she on a special wavelength, incredibly intuitive? Perhaps all I needed was faith, to be in tune with Toyoko. Had I not only hours ago been miraculously preserved? Toyoko, I murmured her name. Wait for me, Toyoko. Suddenly I heard the roar of planes, approaching at tremendous speed, and seconds later the keening of an air raid alarm. Without the slightest additional warning, Hellcats came thundering off the jungle roof, swarming upon us in waves of 5. I bolted upright, staring as the 2 mechanics dashed my way, heading for cover. The distant construction crew scattered in every direction, but they were too late. Already the first flights were opening up, spraying the area voraciously with their guns. I watched as bullets stitched and spattered the concrete, casting up lethal little puffs of dust, overtaking 6 fugitives, reducing them to shattered corpses in an instant. Suddenly, aware of my own vulnerability, I struggled to my feet and staggered blindly into the jungle. Hurling myself to the earth, I lay there panting, peering back in time to see one of the mechanics plunging into the underbrush nearby. The second was less fortunate, trapped in a hail of lead just short of cover, upended and rolled violently for several yards as though hit by a truck. 4 men, including the 2 driving steamrollers, had escaped the first 2 waves and were feigning death in the middle of the field, but their ruse was futile. A 3rd wave of Hellcats, bellowing low across the strip, ravaged them unmercifully with their guns. I saw the bodies writhe and roll, one of them half rising to twist and sprawl, face down, convulsing. The enemy fighters cavorted about, uncontested, blasting everything in sight, having a marvellous time. Not the slightest protest or most feeble attempt to retaliate. A hangar was flaming now, disgorging billows of brown and black smoke. A line of obsolete kamikaze planes and several escort fighters were ripped to shards, some exploding and burning. Finally, their ammunition spent, the enemy planes circled, arching above the flames and through the rising smoke, climbing triumphantly into the blue, sunlight exploding and scintillating like immense blowtorches from their windshields. Furtively, I crept from the undergrowth to inspect my Hayabusa, but it had escaped detection there in the shadow of the jungle. Then, weary beyond all measure, so weary the destruction on every hand scarcely registered, I wandered across the field to make my report. Who I would report to or where, I didn't know. Perhaps there was no headquarters left. Tomorrow there would probably be more attacks, more deaths, more aircraft demolished. But now I wanted only one thing: to report in and be assigned a place to sleep, anywhere. Eventually I discovered the orderly room, still intact, and half an hour later, dead on my feet, I collapsed on a dirty cot against a wall between two rusty lockers. Nearby, some men were playing cards at a table, laughing boisterously at times, as if the war had never come. The room was thick with cigarette smoke, blue swirls so dense I could scarcely discern their faces. It didn't matter. The entire base still reeked with smoke. Nothing mattered. How long since I had seen her? Days? Weeks? Surely not that very morning. Tatsuno? I saw his grey and faded countenance, the enigmatic smile, his Mitsubishi knifing downward, the wounded ship wallowing and swallowed in the waves, the leering giants of the storm. But where was Nakamura? Who knew? Gone forever, perhaps. The feeling in his bones. Uno and Kimura and the rest of our escorts. Gone? I sighed, flung my forearm across my brow, dreamed deliriously, mind and soul resonating with sound and violence, swirling irresistibly on the vast and drifting panoply of the ocean, horizon upon horizon, always the beyond and the beyond and the beyond. Once I surfaced upon the rim of some immeasurable significance, moaning and mumbling incoherently, pleading for the answer. I remember emerging, bathed in the stifling dampness, my body fairly steaming, and hearing a voice. "Take it easy, fighter pilot. Just relax." Someone was wiping my face and arms with a damp cloth. Just relax. Now he was actually fanning me with a towel, and I drifted off again, this time into blessed emptiness. For 2 weeks I remained at that remote spot as an instructor for their kamikaze. What a unique and dire assignment, actually teaching men how to die. The rationale behind it all, the great and mysterious why, I left to others. No longer could I find a respectable answer. It would require the ultimate miracle of miracles to reverse the fortunes of war now, a miracle beyond the most fantastic imagination. The handwriting was upon the wall, and the wall was crumbling rapidly. We were merely dying for the sake of dying. Honour? What honour? Why? Increasingly now, images returned of my friend Shiro Nomoto, there in the white hospital bed, his leg gone, seeing the face of his mother, and hearing her words. "Listen to me, my sons. There is nothing honourable in dying for a lost cause." But daily the condemned men left to perform their own execution, another and another and another. I bade them my pathetic farewells, watched them rise above the burning concrete, above the dark and secret jungle, circling the field and waggling their wings in a last sayonara. 2 hours after their departure, signal men at the base would listen for the high, long-drawn beeping noise, swelling their eustachian tubes and piercing their eardrums, signals that the attack was underway. Then, often in less than a minute, like scissors cutting a taut cord, the sound would end. Silence. Oblivion. Sayonara, you loyal, hopeless sons of Nihon. Mere memories now. I did not learn what had become of our other escorts, my companions at Okinawa, for several days. Uno was the only one who had returned to Oita. Nakamura and Kimura had vanished, and I had also been reported missing in action initially. Uno had seen me plunging toward the convoy, Hellcats close behind, and had assumed the worst. Appropriately for the worst had only seemed reasonable. There was still a remote possibility that Nakamura and Kimura had escaped as I had, perhaps landing on some island along the Ryukyu chain extending southwest below Kyushu. But very doubtful. Nakamura. At my last glimpse of him, he was gunning down the enemy, but something beyond mere assumption told me that he was gone now, gone like the true samurai. Yes, truly gone. My sorrow? It was only an ongoing numbness. Perhaps some day the numbness would subside, blossoming into the black flower of pain. So all my friends had entered the unknown now, and I waited alone in the sultry afternoons of Formosa, watching daily as our kamikaze departed, some of them pilots younger than I with little training or skill. Death hovered in the very atmosphere, in the odour of smoke, gasoline and oil that never fully dissipated, in the coppery smell of newly flowing blood. Or was it only there within my brain cells? No matter, it was always present, always there, even on those afternoons as I wandered an empty beach, sometimes swam in the ocean, wondering if the tide might take me out beyond the point of no return. Drowning itself seemed a mild and uneventful death these days, almost pleasurable. At times I sat upon the shore, letting the tide glide up about my feet, fading in its endless and fizzing minuscule bubbles, each bubble transient like life itself. But always the odour of death. Unending thoughts of Toyoko. In all likelihood she thought I was dead now, or perhaps she had checked with the base and discovered that I was still alive. Again, maybe she had decided I was indeed far too young, that it would be better to end things. After all, nearly 7 years separated us in terms of age. Perhaps she had returned to her lieutenant in Fukuoka and worked things out. How strange to think that we had known each other only a few short weeks, that we had known each other at all. It was only part of the fond and foolish dream, a mirage lost far behind in the ocean. The day before my departure, 8 suicides racketed into the sky, wheeling broadly, dipping their wings, and headed out. Then, strangely, one of them circled back, angling, it seemed, for a landing. For a moment I thought he was experiencing engine trouble, but I was wrong. "He'll never make it," a voice cried. "Coming in too steep. Too fast." "Heading for the hangar," someone else yelled. "Do something." "Do what?" I shouted angrily. "Fire engines!" Another shout. An instant later I hit the concrete as the plane ripped into the hangar in a deafening, brain-numbing explosion, erupting in a huge red-orange fireball. In mere seconds the entire hangar was ablaze, belching smoke black as the pit and vanquishing the sun. Sirens wailed. Men scrambled, shouting and swearing. Within only 2 or 3 minutes a fire truck was on hand, spraying the flames with a long arching stream of water, but it was like trying to extinguish a bonfire with a squirt gun. The entire effort, in fact, seemed almost farcical. I watched calmly, disdainful of their clumsy efforts, but suddenly the adjoining hangar erupted as well in a whole series of explosions, and the fire crew staggered back, stumbling over themselves, over the hose which, freed from their grasp, lashed about like a wounded python, spraying everything in sight, knocking men from their feet, even as they struggled to arise. Fantastically, the detonations continued, fireball after fireball, fiendish in their brilliance and ferocity, and already the smoke was so intense the day had become night. Thousands of gallons, almost all that was left of our fuel reserves, were going, and now our remaining fighters. Never yet had I seen or heard anything like it, and for some reason I was feeling a remarkable sense of exhilaration, literal jubilation. The fire and smoke gradually subsided a bit, but persisted for nearly 2 hours, and when at length the sun reappeared, it looked wan and surrealistic, the colour of tarnished silver. Afterward, a note was discovered which the dead pilot had left in a sealed envelope with one of his companions as he departed, instructing him to read it an hour later. Penned that morning, it contained some terse observations regarding Japan's hopeless plight and the futility of war. The conclusion read as follows: "My fellow comrades, by the time you read these words, I will be gone. Please do not judge me harshly or in anger. What is done for good reason. Perhaps some day our leaders and people everywhere will come to understand the insanity of war. For now, I pray that my own miserable efforts will enable others here to live. Our country's surrender is at the doors, and by the time you read these words, there will be fewer planes for men to waste their lives in and far less fuel for any who remain. Fortunately or unfortunately, I will never be sure, my Hayabusa had been repaired and fueled before the grand destruction, parked, hidden with several others to escape enemy detection within a fringe of trees and undergrowth near the spot where I had originally landed. The following morning I winged off over the jungle, leaving that wretched, lonely place forever. Part 6. Chapter 26. Lighter than a Feather. It was the last of June 1945 when I landed again at Oita. I had flown back through China, crossing over the East China Sea to avoid American fighters. Frantic to see Toyoko, I rushed to the orderly room to report in. How would she react upon seeing me? Had she discovered that I was still alive? Perhaps, but Uita had merely received an official communication regarding my survival, one that might not be revealed to anyone outside the base. Furthermore, as I had discovered a day or two earlier, none of my personal letters to her or to my family had ever left Formosa. The mail in that area was largely inoperative. The desk sergeant glanced up indifferently when I entered, as though I had never left the base. "You're to report to the commanding officer immediately, Kuwahara," he said. I stared at him. "Immediately?" "Yes, immediately." Dumbfounded, I turned and shuffled out the door. My excitement had changed to dread, but there was nothing to do except clean up and change as quickly as possible. There in the barracks, countless thoughts surged through my mind. I had supposed that Uno's report 2 weeks ago was sufficient. What more could I tell Captain Tsubaki than he had already learned? Soon I was striding across the base at an ever-increasing pace. What could he want? Not even giving me time to catch my breath? Didn't the man have any idea what I'd been through? That I had just flown all the way from Formosa? Upon entering Tsubaki's office, I found him deeply preoccupied with a great pile of paperwork, and for a moment he failed to acknowledge my presence. Nevertheless, I reported crisply in the prescribed manner and held my salute. Seconds later, the captain looked up, gazing at me a bit oddly as though we had never met before. Then, peremptorily, he returned my salute, barely fanning his eyebrow, and turned back his papers. "Be seated, Kuwahara," he said. Eventually he regarded me again, and this time his expression was somewhat different, intensely searching, unnerving. Where, I wondered, had I seen that look before? "How are conditions in Formosa?" he inquired. Momentarily I was tongue-tied, wondering what he expected. "You mean, Honourable Captain?" I mumbled. "Planes, ammunition, fuel, morale. What's going on there?" For a second or two I struggled with the urge to be evasive, then decided on bluntness. "There is little left of anything," I said. "Anywhere. Kochi, the base where I was stationed this past 2 weeks, is dying. Day before yesterday, in fact." I hesitated. "What? In fact, what?" "One of our kamikaze turned back and dived into the main hangar. The one next to it was full of fuel, and both of them went up along with about 20 fighters." "Remarkable," Tsubaki mused. "But why? Did anyone ever find out?" "Yes, Honourable Captain. He left a message insisting that we had already lost the war and that he hoped his death would save the lives of others." "Remarkable," Tsubaki repeated. "Quite remarkable." Leaning back, arms folded, he perused the upper walls and part of the ceiling as though searching for an answer. "Rather ironic as well, wouldn't you say?" I stared at him uncertainly, and he shrugged, holding out his hands. "A kamikaze, attacking his own military. Isn't that a bit ironic?" "Yes, Honourable Captain," I answered. "I understand what you are saying." "So what is your view of the situation?" he asked. "Of the war itself?" The question shocked me, and for a second or two I merely looked at him, feeling my throat working. "I am a mere corporal, Honourable Captain," I finally replied. "That does not matter," he insisted, almost angrily. "You have been there at the heart of it. What is your honest, objective view of the war?" For a moment I faltered, groping for words. "The enemy is triumphing, honourable captain," I said, and for an awful moment feared I might actually begin crying in the presence of my commanding officer, literally a humiliation worse than death. Everywhere. I stared hard at the floor, feeling my eyes sting. Okinawa, Formosa, everywhere. Soon the enemy will be at our shores, firebombs from the B-29s descending upon every city, as they have before upon Tokyo and other places. I felt the swelling in my throat, the choking sensation. Nothing remains but the dying. The captain made no reply. No sound but the distant droning of motors, omnipresent yet steadily fading more each day it seemed, etherizing. "So what is it like out there over Okinawa?" I glanced up. Tsubaki was gazing through the window toward the ocean. Again I struggled for a reply. "Indescribable, I suppose," he said quietly. "Yes, honourable captain, indescribable." "You lost your best friend in that last attack," Tsubaki observed, and again I felt surprise. Until then I had no idea that he was even aware of my relationship with Tatsuno. "Yes, honourable captain, 2 of my best friends, Nakamura also, I'm afraid." Yoshiro Tsubaki nodded, pursing his lips, inhaling deeply. Still the distant gaze, his eyes reflecting the afternoon light, filled with a faint but steady burning. "Mere boys," he shook his head. "Out there in the sky. Planes falling apart and all that fire coming up. I waited, merely waited. What was there to say? And the enemy? Do you hate the enemy with a burning passion? Long for his annihilation?" "Sometimes I hate the enemy, Captain," I replied cautiously. "Sometimes—" "Yes?" Tsubaki's face welled with perception. "Sometimes I hate our leaders in Tokyo." I took a deep breath, feeling my entire body quiver. "Yes," my voice cracked. "I hate them for what they have done to this nation, for their eternal lies to our people. The Daihonei. Even after the bombs have fallen upon their very heads, their voices will swell up from the ground like sewer gas. All is well, O people of Japan. Fear not, gullible, stupid people of Japan. This is all a part of the glorious plan." I buried my face in my hands, forcing back the sobs. Whose plan? Simultaneously, I was dimly aware that I had spoken rank heresy, words that might well justify a general court-martial, even execution. But what did it matter?